Trump's press secretary now says the U.S. is in the early stages of deciding whether the American embassy in Israel should be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
The United Nations Security Council are now calling for an urgent meeting to address President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
What is your opinion on the U.S. moving its embassy to Jerusalem?
So the idea that the United States is planning to move the embassy to Jerusalem, I think, is problematic in many ways.
Israel has been a dramatic focal point of international politics since the turn of the 19th century. The focus on the former Middle Eastern territory of Great Britain was amplified after the end of the Second World War. We set out to answer what we thought was a simple question: why was the formation of Israel inevitable? Through extensive research, we have concluded that a Zionist movement, persecution, and immigration were the leading factors that led to the creation of Israel. This story surprisingly begins in the 19th century.
There are some people who assert, and I think they're wrong, that the Jewish state, the modern Jewish state of Israel, was created as a result of the guilt of many of the nations of the world for the Holocaust, over the Holocaust, the death of 6 million Jews. The truth is that Zionism as a modern movement preceded the Holocaust. There was Zionism from the 19th century on.
Zionism was the national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Many Jewish European leaders called upon Zionist principles for over half a century.
So there wouldn't be an Israel without the Zionist movement, because the Zionist movement was successful at laying down the foundation for what a Jewish state in the land of Palestine would look like. And there was a lot of kind of popularity around this idea throughout Europe and even in the U.S.
This Jewish nationalist movement came from the constant persecution of the Jewish people. 1900 years of constantly being persecuted, oppressed, and exiled closely united and eventually empowered Jews.
Frequently, Jews would be invited into a country because the emperor or the king saw in the Jewish group abilities in the area of finance, in the area of political understandings. And then once they had achieved what they wanted from the Jews, they exiled them.
The persecution was important in uniting the Jewish people because of the shared trauma. And you don't even have to look at the Holocaust. There were awful things happening to Jews everywhere in Europe. So I think you could even think about it as like African Americans here in the United States or other minority groups that face that kind of persecution or racism. They tend to coalesce, they tend to come together for a common cause, and there becomes a real kind of motivation to come together and to put aside differences. So you create like clear objectives.
And two things happen when you become persecuted. You become very insular, you fold into yourself, and the other is you are determined to break out of it and seek freedom. And so persecution, in part, led to the creation of the Zionist movement, which eventually led to Jews coming back to the ancient homeland and creating a Jewish state.
There is no doubt that Jewish people have a sense of connection because of their common struggles. This sense of connection and pride to be Jewish is what started the Zionist movement. A direct effect of the Zionist movement was the increase in immigration of Jews into Palestine. By the early 1930s, there were already dramatic cultural changes happening in Israel. In the span of just 90 years, the Jewish population had exploded from 20,000 to about 400,000. The British, who had the mandate to Palestine from the old League of Nations, viewed this immigration as illegal and tried their best to stop it.
Where Jews were being brought after the Second World War, from the displaced persons camps into Israel, illegally from the British point of view, but they were building up the Jewish population of what eventually, of course, became the land of Israel.
Jews who had survived the Holocaust often had no home or family to go back to in their country, and so became determined to live in the already extensive Jewish Palestinian population. Many of these Jews were living in displaced persons camps. A study on Jews in these camps found that a remarkable 95% of them wanted to live in Palestine. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jews were basically transferred from concentration camps to displaced person camps to overcrowded jails in Palestine because their immigration was illegal. After World War I, Britain promised Jewish people in Palestine their own territory. 30 years later, the pressure was mounting for them to come through with their promise.
The British were expected by the Jews to fulfill their promise of the creation of a state of Israel, of a Jewish state. But what happened was there was enormous pressure from many of the Arab countries against this. And because England and the United States, for that matter as well, were becoming dependent on oil from the Middle East, there was a reluctance to actually create a Jewish state. Now,
this reluctance did in fact inhibit the formation of Israel for some time, but the British claim to Palestine weakened as the British did not have the money or the manpower to reconstruct their country and maintain their firm grip on their colonies.
So Palestine is the hearth of Jewish culture and the religion. So there was a lot of need for a homeland to be created so that the Jews could escape the persecution and go somewhere that would be not only where they're really from, but also where they could be safe from the amount of persecution they were experiencing in Europe. So when the Second World War ends, the United Nations is created, it was kind of like a go to really lobby the newly formed UN to create Israel in Palestine. I think
one of the first things the newly created United Nations did was partition a two-state project in 1947. This proposal angered both Jews and Arabs and led to immediate fighting and the Israeli Declaration of Independence. This Declaration of Independence was declared by David Ben-Gurion on May 14th in 1948. Finally, the Jewish people had their first country in over 2,000 years. After this declaration in 1948, 7 Arab nations made war against the newly born Jewish state. The Jews emerged with independence intact and increased territory, but with thousands of casualties. As much as this is a story of triumph of the Jewish people, it is also a story of tragedy of Arab Palestinians and the terrible losses that both sides have had during their ongoing conflict. Many lives and friendships have been lost, and people have had to live in hatred of one another, as well as fear for their lives. The United Nations Partition Plan of 1947 called for Jerusalem to be a cultural and spiritual center for Jews, Muslims, and Christians that should not be controlled by any one country. The adoption of Jerusalem being the capital of Israel by the United States completely goes against that plan, and is a step backwards in the Israeli peace efforts. It became apparent to us when interviewing the Rabbi Bernay that Israel, and more specifically Jerusalem, is much more than a place, but rather a cultural and spiritual center, and that the old United Nations plan to keep Jerusalem as a free city, not owned by any country or government, was not only a wise decision, but a crucial one if Israelis and Palestinians ever plan to cohabitate in peace.